Good evening, folks. Good evening. This is Edward Carlson from Race Matters, and you're listening to WJOP LP Newburyport, Joppa Radio 96.3 FM. I'm excited to have y'all join me this evening for a conversation. And what we're going to do is we're going to get the ball rolling. We're going to pick up where we left off on the last show. And we're going to delve into critical race theory, part 2. As I noted in part 1, you may recall, critical race theory is an academic concept, a form of analysis developed in the 1970s and 80s by legal scholars, particularly those legal scholars by the name of Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. It suggests that our nation's history of race and racism is embedded in law and public policy. Still, it plays a major role in shaping the outcomes, particularly for Black Americans in this nation. And of course, other people of color too. So let's keep that in mind and should be taken into account when these issues are discussed. It has been clear, particularly when we think about the construction of its definition, that one, its critics have chosen not to rationally engage with and not to really fathom and think about the elements of critical race theory and what that means. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to really kind of jump into the funk just a little bit tonight. And again, I invite you to reach out to me if you have comments, you have questions. If you just want to have a conversation with me, you can reach me at my email, racematterspodcast@gmail.com. So I hope you will find some time and join a soul brother and help me think about some of the things that we have to think about while I sit here and I pontificate just for a little bit about critical race theory part 2. You know, last week, or in the last episode, I should say, we spent quite a bit of time really delving into, what is critical race theory, really surgically kind of really expanding the nomenclature of this term and, how it's been inculcated in different ways. We talked a little bit about those who support it, those who disagree with it. I gave you my 2 cents in terms of its historical narrative and perspective on critical race theory and how we look into the tenets of CRT and how it defines us in so many different ways too. And in many ways, how it defines a soul brother such as myself. As we think about the early origins of it, the late Harvard law professor, Derek Bell, and bless that brother's soul, because I got to tell you, Derek Brown has just been influential for a lot of folks. And we think about Derek Bell, we go back to something that I mentioned on the last show, and that is this idea of when we talk about race, when we talk about the construction of race, when we think about the narratives that unfold, when we look at this, one of the things we do know, of course, is the fact that historically, what's been acceptable has been things that white people deemed acceptable, and it's okay for us to move forward and it's okay for us to think about right now. But yet it was and again, that's the idealist perspective, and I mentioned that on the last episode. But when we look at the realist school of thought, and this is where the soul brother Derek Bell comes in, the late Harvard law professor Derek Brown, he particularly garnered a lot of attention when he critiqued the case Brown v. Board of Education, taking us back to 1954. And in Brown v. Board of Education and the Convergence dilemma, noted that the 14th Amendment alone could not effectively promote racial equality for Black people, where such a remedy threatened the superior social status of wealthy white people in this country. I'd further that sense by pointing out to the fact that Bell noted that Brown was decided the way it was because of what he deemed interest convergence. And that's the second time I've used that term, and I think we got to really talk about that. And essentially, interest convergence is it's the recognition that the interests of Black people in achieving racial equality will be accommodated only when it converges with the interest of white people. And when it does, then, of course, we can move forward and talk about absolute racial progress and racial healing. One of the things that I mentioned, of course, during the last episode of Race Matters is the fact that the United States was in a contested ideological conflict with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union and her allies really looked to the United States as being somewhat of a falsity when we think about democracy. How can you claim to be a democratic state when in many ways you still allow lynching to take place for a segment of your population? You deny them educational entrance to various places. You segregate. You discriminate when it comes to housing, when it comes to health care. All of those things because you believe that if you are someone who was born a Christian, you believe that, well, somehow this mark has deemed people second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th class citizenship. And because of that, of course, that interest wasn't there. You know, the United States really being aware of this ideological conflict, Bell's going to contend like a lot of other folks will contend, which is the fact that some semblance of progress is going to have to happen. Some semblance of progress is going to have to move forward. And that's when we get, of course, to Brown v. Board of Education. You know, I think back to a statement that the American Bar Association recently put out dealing with the issue of critical race theory. And in a statement, there's a professor by the name of Tara Yoso. And Professor Yoso is a brilliant soul sister and someone I'm excited who's going to come join me at the Governor's Academy to really engage in a conversation about CRT, racism, and what that means for us. The ABA states, of course, that critical race theory does not define racism in traditional manner as solely the consequence of discrete, irrational, bad acts perpetrated by individuals, but is usually the unintended, but often foreseeable consequence of choices. It exposes the ways that racism is more cloaked in terminology regarding mainstream, normal, or traditional values, or neutral policies, principles, or practices. And as a scholar, Professor Yoso asserts that CRT can be an approach used to theorize, examine, and challenge the ways in which race and racism implicitly and explicitly impacts social structures, practices, and discourses. I mean, even from that, you can tell that I'm super excited to have that sister visit us on campus at the Governor's Academy, as she's going to really delve into the funk and help us understand the processes by which CRT has manifested in different ways. You know, it's also important to understand that CRT observes that scholarship that ignores race is not only demonstrating neutrality, but adherence in the existing racial hierarchy. You know, if you want to talk about racial hierarchy and the elements that define this notion of race in this country, I highly recommend that you check out Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste. It is worth it. You'll get a lot out of it, and it's going to strike you in many ways, particularly in the sense that a caste system has been formulated and created here in the United States. For the civil rights community, particularly civil rights lawyer, this can be a particularly powerful approach for examining race in society, particularly because CRT has recently come under fire, as we all know. And understanding CRT, critical race theory, and some of its primary tenets is vital for the civil rights movement and the civil rights realities that exist, as particularly seeing that civil rights seeks to eradicate racial inequality in this country. You know, we say that and we think about all the critics, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. We're going to talk about some of the criticism of CRT and what folks are really saying, and why has critical race theory become such a political thing when the vast majority of folks have never even heard of it before. And we're going to really expose, well, why did it all of a sudden pop up on the radar? Why has it really started to drive the cultural wars that we are particularly in? You know, critical race theory is one of those components that that elevates conversations. And for the most part, it elevates conversations in ways in which most people don't even know what to talk about when they talk about critical race theory. And so part one of this episode was designed to give you some content. Part two of this episode is to really kind of delve in a little bit more, probably into the political nature of CRT. Critics of critical race theory have expanded the concept to stand in for anything that really re-examines United States racial history, that hierarchy, that caste that we talked about. A lot of this starts, of course, with the New York Times 1619 project that really looked to rethinking K through 12 and post-high school curriculums that dare to state, and I would say accurately, things such as, well, did you know that the framers, some people call them the founding fathers, enslaved black people? People like to also manifest this idea that, Thomas Jefferson had slaves, and we know that. But the reality of Thomas Jefferson with slaves is that if he could just free those slaves, he would have freed those slaves. It would have happened. Or one of my favorite things, of course, is the fact that the Civil War was not fought over slavery. It had nothing to do with race. It was about culture. It was about heritage. It was all about the issue of states' rights. Culture, heritage, and states' rights, that sounds like an economic system known as slavery in this country. So these are some of the things that really people get kind of annoyed by when CRT comes up. It's not just a lens, though, by which we have to analyze society when we think about CRT. It is, in the words of Russell Vought, a former director of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. And he's going to say this, and I quote, that brother contends that it's an insidious form of un-American propaganda, is what he's called critical race theory. Legal scholars, academics, people who really felt the semblance of oppression for a long period of time are saying that race and racism is not an individual thing, but it is systemic and it is system-wide. And folks are saying, no, it's just un-American, it's just propaganda, and it's put out for different reasons. When I was pondering this episode in this two-part series, I started thinking, when did we get to this impasse the way we are? And again, don't get me wrong, I think we've been there for a period of time. And I think the reality, of course, is the fact that if you work with me just for a second, right? So let's go back. About a year ago, okay? Or maybe even probably a little over a year ago now, the police killing of George Floyd rocked this country, setting off the largest mass civil rights protests in a generation and inspiring a wave of soul-searching folks to really think about the role that race and racism still plays in American life. And people were doing that. You start seeing these books being written. You start seeing a lot of institutions talking about we need to do better. We need to be better. We need to think about this. You had a lot of white people really stepping back and saying that I have to be better. Where I work, society has to be better. There's this amazing emotional calling from folks to make things better. A lot of folks will say, "Oh, we're seeing just the rise of this white racial reckoning when it comes to the truth of issues like race, racism, police brutality, and the power dynamics that currently exist in so many ways." A lot of folks are starting to sit there and they're thinking that we're making progress on issues of race matters. White people are now talking about this in legitimate and authentic ways that they have not spoken about in such a long period of time. But you got to keep in mind, though, folks, as quickly as that wave rolls, it created and it crashed quickly, at least among some groups, dialogue and conversations about systemic and structural racism. We go back to the summer of George Floyd. We saw Republicans and whites in particular really starting to kind of wrestle with this idea of, well, what does this mean? And many of these Republicans, many white folks in particular, have really become less supportive. And I call this in a post-George Floyd era of things such as Black Lives Matter movement. And this is only intensified after the death of George Floyd. Right? I was telling you, people were having conversations, book studies. I was getting calls and emails at my office where people were like, Brother Carlson, tell me, what do I need to read? How can I be a better white person? How can I be a better human being? And my response to folks was, well, let's just break bread. Let's have a conversation. But the most important thing that you can do is you can see me and you can hear me and you can experience the reality that a number of black and brown folks are going through at this particular time. That's some of the thinking that was kind of, going through my mind at that time. So again, why, of course, are we seeing some folks, particularly having a shift in this dynamic and really rejecting things like Black Lives Matter and Black progress after the death of George Floyd? I have a couple of thoughts on this. I think in some ways, this has to do with the theoretical. And I think it's because critical race theory is a theoretical conversation of racial injustice turned into a more direct and personal challenge to the race in power. And think about that for a second, right? There's a racial dynamic that's starting to happen where folks are wanting to be heard and they wanting to be seen. You're starting to see things such as calls for racial accountability. And these calls for racial accountability can, feel like an attack when you aren't ready to acknowledge how your behavior, or better yet, how your ancestors have harmed others. And that becomes the element that's there. So, when your priority is to preserve a particular mythology, the United States is the land of equal opportunity, for example. The push to take a critical view of the United States' racial history becomes a threat. This is the home of the brave and the free. This land is, in many ways, it's perfect, and you can just work hard and you can achieve a lot of the things you want to achieve. People don't care about your color. People don't care about your gender. People don't care about those things. People want to respect and they want to admire you based off how hard you work. But we also know that that's not true. And that's not the reality when we talk about race in this country. Not everyone's going to agree with me on that. And I understand. This idea of racial history becoming a threat is interesting. It might result in some ways in a real rethinking of the order of things, which might result in this sense of culpability, which might result in recognition that addresses issues that are needed and things that we must confront. One of the scariest words out there is the word reparations. No one wants to talk about that. And that's another whole conversation that we're going to have at another time when we think about the matters of race matters. For many white people, this long year of trying to be non-racist was more than enough. George Floyd, of course, died at the hand of police brutality. And white folks saw this, and it was captured on camera. But folks, we've captured a lot of things on camera. The whole shooting of Tamir Rice was caught on camera. We can go back to the 90s when Rodney King was beaten senselessly. That was caught on camera. We can go on and on and on, and there are lots of examples. But George Floyd really felt like a turning point. And somehow something happened where it felt like things were turning, and we just didn't quite get there. In a post-George Floyd world where anti-racist reading lists, as I mentioned early on, people reading out to me, they want to know a little bit more about what they can do better or what their employers could do better. You start to see things such as companies like John Deere, for example. And John Deere is not exactly a paradigm of inclusion in terms of something that's felt by all folks, though I'm sure John Deere is a great business. I don't know much about it, to be honest with you. But John Deere came out and they pledged to fight racial inequality. Being openly and uncomfortable with discussions of racial justice in many ways is just passé, right? Because everyone is uncomfortable with it. No one wants to talk about race. No one wants to deal with this. Suggesting that you'd rather not change the racial status quo is seen justifiably as immoral, but disguising one's discomfort with racial issues, it brings us to this interesting critique that's intellectual and it's moral and it's human. Get down to a couple little examples here and everything too, because there's a lot for us to process as we think about things in schools, particularly the attack on secondary schools for delving in and talking about the issues of critical race theories. I was watching a YouTube video of a conversation on Fox News, and one person stated, critical race theory is racist. I'm still trying to make sense of that myself. But one person on the show said critical race theory is racist. Another person, the second person, said these theories that are not based in fact, they're not. There's no evidence that racism or systemic nor structural racism exists in our society. These are things that are really brought up by folks who are looking to propagandize, really create these elements that don't exist among other folks. And then another person's going to jump in this conversation on YouTube that's happened among some Fox folks. And this person states, you know what? Critical race theory is racist. It is abusive. It's interesting because, again, we think back to the late 70s and early 80s when legal scholars developed an academic approach to examining American institutions and laws through the lens of race and racism. It really started to help us understand, this framework for the challenges that exist. So it's been around, of course, for decades, a long time. And I know a lot of folks just heard about it, what seems like yesterday or this summer. For a lot of people. But, let's just be honest. Many Republicans and right-wing media have co-opted this term, and I'm just going to call it for what it is. I'm a truth teller, and I'm just going to name it. Republicans and right-wing folks have just co-opted this term. They've used something as a punching bag that they don't quite fully grasp nor understand. And they're using it as a catch-all way of describing basically any conversation about race or racism that's taking place, and particularly anything that deals with race and racism that makes white people feel uncomfortable. White folks should not feel uncomfortable talking about race. This is not about white guilt. This is about a conversation, a dialogue that needs to transpire in so many ways. So conversations about white privilege, for example, what does that mean? And again, that's another show, and we're going to talk about white privilege. But we need to really dissect and understand and talk about what white privilege is. What do I think white privilege means? What do white folks, other folks, what do other folks of color, people of color think white privilege means? Having dialogues about anti-racism, in the fact that if we're going to really think about the issue of being an anti-racist in society, it is not okay just to sit around and say, I'm not racist, but to actively combat and really be a soldier against the problems of racism within society that's here. These are really the conversations that should happen. But unfortunately, by folks claiming to be anti-racist, we have seen Republican right-wing media jump on this bandwagon by saying that, this is just another element of critical race theory. And that, of course, folks, is not true. In September of 2020, then President Donald Trump issued an executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. And remember now, this is the same person who barred transgender folks from being in the military. This is the same folks who said in the federal government, we're not going to have diversity training. We're beyond that. Let's just be Americans. No wonder the brother had to cheat on his SATs to get into college, but I won't get into that right now because I'm being biased and I'm showing my true colors. Nope. This is who I am, folks. I'm a truth teller and I'm just being honest here. So we know, of course, that those things are things that Donald Trump's going to push, and I believe Joe Biden has rescinded those. But Trump's executive order didn't actually mention critical race theory. Even in the sections that specify what shouldn't be taught in the armed forces or in the federal agencies were not specifically examined. It's absolutely astonishing how critical race theory has pervaded every institution in the federal government. And what I've discovered is that critical race theory has become, in essence, the default ideological naming of federal bureaucracy and is now being weaponized against Americans. People who look like me, people who are white, people who don't even believe in critical race theory. This has been used as a tool, as an instrument against folks. You know, I'll give you this brother by the name of Chris Rufo. I believe I'm pronouncing his name correctly. You know, he's a central player in all of this. He is a former documentarian, and he is one of the people who called Donald Trump to issue the executive order by saying, hey, I think we have a topic here. This is something that's going to galvanize a lot of folks. If you talk about critical race theory, if you talk about race, then people are going to want to talk about this. They're not going to want to talk about anything else, because one of the ways you keep people divided is you talk about issues that should be talked about, but issues that no one wants to talk about, such as race and racism. And this all started, of course, in July of 2020. So, folks, pull out your calendars. Check your calendars, right? When did you start hearing the language of critical race theory? And I hope you're being honest with yourselves and you're willing to admit the fact that you've never heard this language before. A Seattle City employee sent Chris Rufo an anti-bias training that they did not that they did at work. Okay, so this is a anti-bias training they do at work. I think all organizations should do some anti-bias work. I know my institution does it too, and we have to be aware of it. You know, I participate in hiring in different ways, and because I participate in hiring in different ways, I need to be fully aware of my own processes and my own biases that's there, and those things that are captivated in different ways. So Rufo is going to essentially contend that this is a political opportunity to manufacture a cultural war issue. And he's been transparent about doing this. I mean, the brother did tweet this quote. Let me give you this quote here. It states, "The goal is to have the public read something crazy in a newspaper and immediately think critical race theory." End quote. You know, this essence of let's scare folks, right? Let's just put some type of term, some type of terminology in people's mind that takes their attention away from other things. You know, I can list a lot of other things, but again, that becomes overly political, and I don't want to do that right now. Rufo, he's going to go on and he's going to start by adding things such as this notion of rebranding the theory and driving up negative perceptions to turn it into a toxic conversation. We want to put critical race theory on people's radar in so many ways that they are terrified. They think it is the second coming of the second coming, or for whatever the reason the second coming is. And I don't even know what that second coming is going to be. And I mean, let's just think about it, folks. It worked. We're having this conversation right now. We're talking about CRT. So clearly it's worked. And of course, we know, as I mentioned on the last episode, roughly, I believe, 27 state legislatures have put in bills that ban the teaching of critical race theory. People, high schools don't teach critical race theory. I mean, and the reality is, unless you're into some type of specialty element in grad school, you're not really delving into the funk of critical race theory all that much at all. I mean, that's how well it worked. No one's doing that. You know, if people think that talking about critical race theory is shining some reality on history, now that's another conversation. You know, interesting, when I step into classes, I talk about this term known as redlining, how there was a level of intentionality with bankings and the government to really restructure where black people live, where white people live, to make decisions on who gets loan money, who does not get any type of loan money in order to purchase a house or anything else. So that becomes an element. I mean, let's go back to this whole idea, thinking about Chris Rufo's Twitter. You can go on to Twitter and type in critical race theory, and you'll see a video of hundreds of parents at school board meetings with signs saying, "Stop teaching critical race theory." You got folks at schools looking around like, well, I don't even know what critical race theory is. I don't think I'm really teaching this, but hey, that's what folks are doing. Folks are really going on and they're saying things like critical race theory is being taught in schools. And it's like essentially saying, electrical engineering is being taught in K through 12 schools. Now, I must confess, electrical engineering, I believe, is probably taught at some K through 12 schools, or at least the upper schools, the high schools for sure. In conceptual terms, Chris Ruffo wrote, I quote, "The city frames the discussion around the idea that Black Americans are reducible to the essential quality, or let's not even say quality, how about the essential quality-esque of Blackness, and white Americans are reducible to the essential quality of whiteness." And that is the new metaphysical way of thinking of good and evil. The training was rampant, he wrote, infecting every part of the city's municipal system there in Seattle. It is part of a nationwide movement to make this kind of identity politics the foundation of our public discourse. It may be coming soon to a city or a town near you. Watch out. Be afraid. The evilness of critical race theory. People talking and delving into the funk of what? The power dynamics of race and racism, and what that is, inspired a rush of whistleblowers throughout this country from school districts and federal agencies who reached out to him complaining about diversity training and really worried about them being indoctrinated about how to be sensitive and trying to understand other folks, people who are different, people who don't look like me or you or whatever. Ruffo employed the term for the first time in an article. Critical race theory, this academic discourse centered on the concepts of whiteness, white fragility, and white privilege, is spreading rapidly through the federal government, he wrote. He related anecdotes about training influenced by critical race theory at the Environmental Protection Agency, the FBI, the Treasury Department, among others. He's going to even expand his notion to conservative media. Tucker Carlson, and I don't want to talk a whole lot about that brother, but Tucker Carlson invited him on his Fox News show, during which Ruffo warned viewers that critical race theory had pervaded every institution of the federal government and was being weaponized against Americans. It was like creeping communism, creeping socialism. It was like that movie, The Thing, right? You don't know who is espousing critical race theory, but someone else is, and you should be afraid and you should watch out for it. So we know, of course, that Donald Trump worked to ban such training at the federal level because it was awful. So let's talk a little bit about closer to home here. Let's pick on that brother, Governor Chris Sununu of New Hampshire here for a little bit, right? He signaled that he would object to divisive concepts, that he would really write bills to ban anything dealing with race and racism in the state of New Hampshire. He stated something like this, I quote, "The ideas of critical race theory and all of this stuff, I personally don't think there's any place for that in schools." I suspect if I were to reach out to Governor Chris Sununu and ask him to sit down with me and have a conversation and really delve into that funk just a little bit more, I think he would be blown away by the fact that part of the problem, part of the legacies that continue to exist in the United States is the fact that no one really wants to talk about the past. No one wants to talk about lynching, Jim Crow, genocide. No one wants to delve into any of that stuff. I mean, shoot, I'll give you this other brother, and literally a brother, literally, Byron Donalds. He's an African-American Republican congressman out of the state of Florida. And he said it's important to teach the full history of the country. So he said that. But he thinks that the approach just further divides America. So again, keep in mind, folks, I'm an academic. I write, I lecture, I think about this stuff quite a bit. And I'm hearing this brother by the name of Byron Donalds who says, talking about race in the United States is too divisive. we should just pretend that it never really happened. He didn't say that. That's me. He didn't say that. But this idea that, how do we wrestle with it? He's going to go on. And this is what he's going to also kind of add to this conversation. He thinks our history has actually been quite awful. So I'll give him credit for that, right? This African-American Republican out of Florida is going to say that United States history has been quite awful, but we really shouldn't delve nor talk about this stuff because it's too divisive, and we don't want to engage in this kind of ways. I mean, that's without a question. The ruling legacies of the past here are problematic in so many ways. But you also have to take into account, and this is what he's going to say, that there's been tremendous progress over the past 60 and 70 years, and I agree with him there. There has been a lot of progress. But as that brother Malcolm X said, just because you take a 9-inch dagger and you stab someone in the back and you pull it out 6 inches, right? Do we call that progress? 3 inches of dagger still in your back, but yet at least we pulled it out 6 inches? Well, I don't know. I understand what Malcolm is saying there, and I believe in progress, right? I mean, the reality, of course, is I've been afforded opportunities to engage in communities in different ways because there has been progress in ways that in the Jim Crow days would not have been allowed to happen. But, when I think about issues of talking about race and the misguidedness of talking about race, I think back to this past week when I think about the Green Bay Packers quarterback, Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers, he recently made a public comment on the Pat McAfee show after testing positive for COVID-19. And what he's going to claim is the fact that he believes in body autonomy. Interesting how many people believe in body autonomy when it comes to COVID, but yet folks are pushing back against folks who believe, particularly females, who believe it's their body and they should have the right to autonomy to whatever they want to do with their body. So that whole conversation is a whole nother thing. And, I digress because I can go on and on. But Aaron Rodgers, during his appearance on the show, he quoted Martin Luther King Jr. in an attempt to justify his criticism of the NFL's protocols for unvaccinated players and the COVID-19 vaccine itself. He's going to go on and he's going to claim that what is it that folks are looking for me to do? There have been conversations with it, he's going to contend, but he's going to make the COVID thing a racial thing. And one of the ways he's going to make a racial thing is he's going to quote MLK, which a lot of folks tend to do. He's going to add that I would add to this mix as an aside that the great MLK said, right? And this is coming out of Aaron Rodgers' mouth. The great MLK said that you have a moral obligation to object to unjust, he's going to say unjust rules. MLK really said unjust laws and rules that make no sense. Misappropriating MLK. Tell me if you've never heard that before. He's quoting MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail, where Brother King actually wrote, one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. If you've never read a letter from a Birmingham jail, I highly recommend that you read it because King really delves into this in a particular surgical way where he talks about the fact that race and racism is problematic. It's ubiquitous and it's a driving element in society in that there are immoral laws that are not allowing for progress, and you can't follow immoral laws. Most folks don't know that Brother King was arrested, I think like 32, 33 times. And when he was arrested, he believed that every time he had to spend a day in jail, there was a level of morality that's there. But these are the conversations that folks don't want to have when we talk about CRT. Aaron Rodgers is essentially misappropriating what Brother King had to say, primarily because he's focused on himself and how he can spread COVID. Nothing else. Critical race theory is a perfect culture war issue. And it really is. It's one of those matters that gets people all riled up and upset. Unlike issues like taxes or foreign policy, this is something that strikes people at their very identity. And that's what makes it an effective political strategy, to be honest with you. Christine Matthews, she was Trump's bellwether research and public opinion pollster. And she says that there's evidence, and she was telling this to Trump, that Republican voters have been responding much more positively to cultural issues than they do anything else. And if you want people to turn out and support you, then really turn up the mic, amplify it just a little bit more. Get folks thinking about the things that divide us. Critical race theory doesn't divide us. Using critical race theory as a weapon divides us. Conservatives are not the only critics, of course, of diversity training. For years, some progressives, including critical race theorists themselves, have questioned its value. In some of the ways they've questioned its value is the fact that they're going to see it as performative, right? George Floyd's killed. Now everyone is signing this contract. We're going to end racism. We're going to be better. We're going to hire more black people, more people of color. We're going to do things to make this country better. Is it the most effective way to move toward equity, inclusion, or is it simply an effective way of essentially restating the obvious and unmeaningful notions that we've seen in the past? But that is not the fight, and that's not the element that's materialized over the past year in many ways. Instead, it is confrontation with a cartoonish version of critical race theory. And I want to say that again. Right-wing media, right-wing folks have turned CRT into a cartoonish thing, something that you can't even recognize. Academic folks who delve into this don't even know it. I bring you to another African-American Republican by the name of Tim Scott. He's a senator down in South Carolina. And so Tim Scott stood in front of the United States and, of course, in South Carolina flags to deliver the Republican response. He states, I quote, "From colleges to corporations to our culture, people are making money and gaining power by pretending that we haven't made any progress," Scott said. This stuff is wrong, folks, he goes on to contend. Moreover, Scott says, "Hear me clearly, America. America is not a racist country." Okay? America is not a racist country. You know what? He goes on to say that the problem, of course, with what's going on is that folks talk too much about woke culture and they want to blame everything on the KKK. We don't have a KKK problem. We have a woke problem, according to Senator Tim Scott, over the issues of race. More and more students, as you know, are delving into topics of race in their environments. More and more students, they're wanting to talk and they want to delve into these uncomfortable things. More and more students, they want to hear stories about themselves and people who look like them. On my campus, I teach a course called Climate Justice that delves into issues of environmental racism and how it, as a structural and systemic aspect, has been driving part of the problems that are rooted within the elements and the aspects and the dynamics, I should say, of race and racism in its culture. Next semester, I'll teach a course on race, class, and gender. I've taught courses on African American studies. I've taught courses on thinking about the issue of Black Christianity. I've taught courses and all these courses deal with the issue of talking about race, racism, and systemic structures that's there. And I can tell you, folks, we have a good time in my class. My students, we have great conversations. They feel safe, they feel comfortable, and they walk out and they thank me for really educating them on things that they don't know. They want to know more and more and more about the realities of race that's there, because they want to be able to have a conversation about race and racism and the power dynamics that exist. Those are the things that are happening. As we talk more about critical race theory, folks, we need to read it. Is the first thing we need to do, right? Get a list. What is CRT? What's the literature? And it's a lot of literature, so I don't expect folks to read all that. But the one thing that I want us to do is I want us to talk about the namesake of this show, Race Matters. I'm here to talk about race matters, and I'm here to talk about the fact that race legitimately matters. It matters in our society. It matters in our culture. It matters at every turn we make. I wish we could be a colorblind world, but we're not. And the only way we're going to move closer and closer and closer to being a colorblind society is if we can just sit down and recognize the fact that we are different, and there's no way this notion of colorblindness is ever going to exist. To be able to sit down and talk about issues of race and how race permeates the sense of discomfort and unease. Everyone's not like me. I'm a soul brother. Oh, I'm a soul brother, and I'm comfortable talking about this. And my job is not to make other folks uncomfortable to talk to me about this stuff. If we can do anything, at the end of the day, that would be to talk about our difference, to have a dialogue, to engage in conversations about my experiences. But also, I want to know why white folks feel threatened by people who look like me, or these theories that are espoused about talking about the historical lens of the past, and what do we mean when we talk about systemic and structural racism. So, folks, I appreciate you giving me your ear this evening. A lot of stuff to throw at you. I hope that you'll kind of take it in, you'll process it a little bit more. And remember, if you have any questions for me, feel free to fire me a email at racematterspodcasts@gmail.com. And I'm always willing to sit down and have a conversation with anyone, because that's what I do. I believe in engaging in conversations, not for any type of, contentiousness, or, there's always going to be disagreement. But how can we get to a point where we can advance society and we can work to mend the color line, as W.E.B. Du Bois once noted in his famous 1903 essay, The Souls of Black Folks. All right. Thank you, folks. I appreciate it. It's been great having you on here. And I will check you out on the next episode.